Thank you for joining us for today's Ipsos Foresight webinar, exploring the social and commercial ramifications of uncertainty across industries. Throughout today's session, you will remain in listen-only mode. However, throughout the webinar, please submit your questions online using the Q&A feature. We'll try to answer questions at the end of today's session. However, if time runs short, then your question will be answered by email. I also want to encourage you to check out the handouts we've uploaded into the webinar control panel. A recording of today's webinar will also be directly emailed to you. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Matt Carmichael, editor of What the Future. Matt, you have the floor.
Hey everybody, welcome to one of my new favorite What the Futures on the future of risk. I'm Matt Carmichael, editor of What the Future and your host today. We decided to go a little bleak with the cover image because, well, there are plenty of bleak outcomes in these plausible futures. I mean, just look around. But there are also plenty of opportunities to avoid those futures, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Risk and uncertainty go hand in hand, and in one critical aspect, the world has never been more uncertain. Everything could look very different in 5 years, considering that half of the world's population are having elections in 2024. Elections are known unknowns. You know when they happen. There's even a handy Wikipedia page here with dates and this map. You know who's running. You have a pretty good idea what the candidates will try to do when in office. But the entire geopolitical landscape could be upended by a full term of new leaders or existing leaders in key markets like the US or the EU Parliament, which has been setting benchmarks for regulations and protections in the tech space. There are headwinds for globalization and a global economy. There are nationalistic and populist trends that are rising and could make it harder to tackle worldwide problems like inequality and climate change. In our just released report on the election and foresight, Insights to Activate, our public affairs and strategy 3 teams outline 4 plausible scenarios for the election, 2 of which could lead to a period of upheaval, and both of those are highly plausible, a narrow win by one of the other candidates. That's just bonkers. Preparing for the future is the best risk mitigation strategy. You'll do better work today if you're thinking about tomorrow, and you'll be better prepared for whatever the future brings. It's all about planning and practice. And that's just the geopolitical uncertainty, which risk experts consider to be one of the biggest hazards facing us today, according to the AXA Future of Risks report. And we'll come back to that report in a minute. We see similar concerns in the Ipsos MetLife Chamber of Commerce Small Business Index too. But there's climate change, cybersecurity, economic collapse, a host of other big existential things to worry about. We have personal risks to consider too. And in this issue, we explore several of them. Risks to health, finance, privacy and security, risks to brand, and even peril in the way we entertain ourselves. Think about the Red Bull and Mountain Dew fueled and GoPro filmed adrenaline economy. And even just typing your name and email and password into a form can be a danger these days. People respond differently to risks. It's one of those things where what's risky for one isn't for the other. Men seem more comfortable with risk than women, according to the Ipsos Future of Risk study. About half say they have a high or moderate risk tolerance compared to just 37% of women. Most adults say they carefully weigh the pros and cons of big decisions. But when given the choice, 68% say they think about the long-term consequences of their decisions, versus only 32% who say they live in the moment. And 2/3 of us think it's good to take risks. Some don't think about risk much. In a previous issue of What the Future, 40% said that what happens happens and is in the purview of a higher power. Others align with the quote attributed to the writer Marion G. Harman that everything happens for a reason. And sometimes the reason is you're stupid and make bad decisions. People see things as variably risky. We're willing to take more chances with our financial health than with our physical health. but we're most cautious with our online behavior. We think the world is getting riskier, and a plurality find it difficult to make decisions when faced with uncertainty. Think about risk in the context of your customers. One way to overcome risk aversion is to build trust, to offer good information and enough of it, and from authoritative sources, to outweigh all the bad information that we fear will proliferate with artificial intelligence. Balancing all of that is the fact that the biggest risks come with the biggest payoffs. Of 31 million brackets tracked in the men's NCAA tournament, only 10% were perfect after just the first 6 games. And by the end of the first Friday, only 8, the number, not the percent, were still standing. You're not going to win big making the same picks as everyone else. And that's true for brands as well. Risks can come with rewards, especially if you understand your customers. And even more so if you understand how your customers differ from your staff and your management. It's all a matter of balance. Risky versus conservative, odds versus intuition, how to read the quant and interpret it with a qual. But the best way to deal with risk and uncertainty is the same thing we tell our kids: patience, practice, and planning. Now, when we think about the future at Ipsos, we're thinking about it across several different dimensions: the macro forces, the signals, and the shifts in people, markets, and society. For the future of risk, my colleague Trevor Sedano is looking at shifts in 3 areas. He's looking at AI and automation, where advanced data analytics and AI can help uncover potential hazards that we may have blind spots to, enabling proactive risk management and scenario planning to strategize. However, the increasing dependency on technology amplifies other risks, such as cybersecurity, threatening privacy and data integrity. And the pace of technology change has shown it can outstrip regulatory frameworks. He's thinking about globalization and shifts there. While globalization over the past several decades has fostered economic growth and cultural exchange, it also exposes economies to global market fluctuations and a wider set of potential risks and implications. As we saw during COVID-19 times, an increasingly connected world can accelerate the spread of diseases, posing risk to public health and national security. And thinking about influencers, especially those with large followings, and how they can sway public opinion, impacting consumer behavior, market trends, and even beliefs. Without oversight or safeguard, this power can be misused, spreading misinformation and disinformation, or promoting harmful behaviors, posing risks to society at large, and often vulnerable populations. As always, we have a great panel on this issue. Today you'll hear from Florin Richard, the Chief Risk Officer at AXA XL Americas, Victoria Salinas, the Associate Administrator for Resilience at FEMA, Sam Shepard, Chief Creative Officer of Uncommon Creative Studio, and Kenneth Carter, author and professor of psychology at Emory University. So let's dive in. Everything Everywhere All at Once isn't just the title of an Oscar-winning film. It perfectly describes our future for risk. The exponential nature of a polycrisis, from climate change to geopolitical instability to cybersecurity risks, stands out in AXA's annual Future of Risk report. Florin Richard, the Chief Risk Officer at AXA XL Americas, the Property and Casualty and Specialty Risk Division of AXA, explains the complex picture and what it means for our future. He told Managing Editor Kate MacArthur that business can't avoid risk any longer. They're too pervasive. It's about preparing and mitigating, and that's where we're at. Businesses are beginning to shut down because of cyber attacks. Climate change is upon us. Geopolitical instability. These are all here, he says. And he says we need to think about risk this way instead of avoiding it, which is probably impossible at this stage. Anything you can do to prevent and mitigate is probably the best way to look at this, he says. And as we mentioned at the top, the election cycle this year is especially top of mind for risk managers. Here's what he had to say.
I can't stress enough how big of a statistic it is. Almost half the world population will be having a key election in their country. And we haven't had this before in the past few decades. in the context of what we've seen over the past couple of years in the war coming back to Europe, the increasing tensions in the Middle East right now, but also other areas of the globe are really looking closely at how the countries interact with each other and the tensions out there. So there's really something there which, combined with the whole cyber and cyber war aspect of things, really just enhances, amplifies everything we're seeing from a geopolitical perspective. Corporations really need to understand the trends that the potential future could bring at you in terms of to the business, to your clients, but also society more generally. So I think for any corporation, whether you're in insurance or not, the whole emerging risk identification framework is absolutely critical, because you need to stay ahead of these risks. So it's really hard these days to avoid any of these risks. When you look at what's driving the top 10 here, it's really climate, cyber, geopolitics. You can't stay out of these.
One of the big risks with the election is the rise of social and AI misinformation and disinformation. But that's a problem for brands too. Misinformation has always had the capacity to distort corporate reputations, skew market perceptions, and disrupt business operations. But we're just beginning to see how artificial intelligence can intensify these risks. From online bot networks to AI-powered deepfake robodialers, writes Jason McGrath, Executive Vice President with Ipsos's corporate reputation practice. He writes, today, any piece of misleading information can spread around the world and any brand can be caught in the crossfire. Ipsos Reputation Council report reveals an awareness of the heightened stakes. 3/4 of executive decision makers now consider misinformation to pose a material threat. There are actions that brands can take to mitigate these risks, including advocating for content moderation and leveraging reputation monitoring tools. But the best defense is to operate from a place of trust and transparency. The data backs this up. 45% of people say they'll believe negative information about a company if they distrust it a great deal, while just 3% say they'll believe negative information about a company they do trust a great deal. But brands must stay in the loop about misinformation and respond to it quickly, but they also need the benefits of the doubts from consumers. And keeping that requires a close eye on public opinion, along with creating clear and consistent communications. Back in the world of polycrisis, environmental and climate risks are also a major concern. Victoria Salinas knows that disasters are coming. When she thinks about risk, she's thinking about immediate response, but also preparation and building resilience. She's thinking about how we need design standards for buildings that will still exist in 2021, when the effects of climate change will be profound. She's thinking of diverse and aging populations who are more at risk and how tech can help us care for people remotely. And she's thinking about a phrase that I'm going to use a lot more these days: slow onset disasters that are hard to see. Yet what she finds most alarming is how unprepared we are for the risks we already know. We talked about how the time between major billion-dollar insurance events is now 18 days. There were 57 days in the 1980s. And in 2023, there was an emergency declaration of some sort every 3 days. She says we have to focus on resilience because we don't have the luxury of responding to so many complicated and overlapping recovery efforts. She spoke of areas that are known to have wildfire risks, but where people are woefully unprepared for wildfires. And those are the obvious and immediate risks to plan and prepare for. But again, she talked about some of the more subtle risks we're facing as communities and businesses alike. Here's what she told me.
We are starting to see across the nation these slow onset disasters have really deep impacts. We've had saltwater intrusion down in the Mississippi River that it was affecting the drinking water supply all the way to Jackson, affecting infrastructure. And so you see things like that. You see things like the warming sea levels leading to more sargassum seaweed in the USVIs and having to have an emergency declaration because of lack of drinking water because there was too much seaweed caused by warming oceans. You go all the way up to Alaska, the permafrost is thawing. And so things like ice roads, which are critical infrastructure, Mother Nature's critical infrastructure for Alaska, ice roads, when they're not there, people can't get from place A to place B. The animals aren't migrating in the same way. And so people's food supply is not where it used to be. And so there's all of these things that feel very slow, but are actually creating major impacts in people's lives. And our policies and programs are just starting to catch up to understand how we navigate these new times where these slow onset disasters exacerbated by climate change are causing catastrophic impacts in people's daily life.
How do you prepare for the sudden, unexpected crises, but also these slow, should-be expected crises? It's one thing to do that as a government agency. It's another to do it as a business. The most recent release of Ipsos Global Trends focused on polycrisis, verging on a permacrisis. We are just coming out of the field for the new release, which is coming soon. But helping organizations prepare for certain uncertainty is what Trends and Foresight work is all about. There are a lot of known scenarios that companies can and should be preparing for. In a recent global Ipsos study, 63% say their country needs a strong leader to take the country back from the rich and powerful. And these populist sentiments in many markets are coupled with nationalist sentiments and the idea that people need different, not necessarily smaller government, writes Nick Chiarelli, a principal in Ipsos's Trends and Foresight practice. He writes, what does that mean for our global economy and supply chains in the next 5 to 10 years? Depending on which elections go which ways, we could see very different futures. And uncertainty is fuel for populism. The best way to cope with uncertainty is to plan for several plausible scenarios, then measure and adjust. That said, we're going to shift from preparation and planning for essentially existential risks to a couple of people who lean into risk, but with a good understanding of where the limits are. How do brands weigh creative risks, for instance, in a world that's increasingly partisan, sensitive, and immediate? Sam Shepard is an acclaimed creative director known for pushing the boundaries of advertising. His career has spanned agency giants like Leo Burnett, DDB, Deutsch, and 360i, and he's been revered for gutsy campaigns like The Lost Class for Change the Ref. Now, Chief Executive Officer at Uncommon Creative Studios in New York, he says brands can navigate creative risks in an evolving business world. Shepard told Kate that he firmly believes risk is important in brand advertising creative. In order to achieve fame, he says, you need friction. But what does that mean? But that doesn't mean you can be reckless. And you have to watch how you tread in today's polarized world. Regardless of what you do, you'll wind up offending someone. Here's what he had to say.
The key to a great brand voice is acting more human, right? And so to be human is to have a differing point of view. No matter what, you are always going to offend someone. That's just part of human nature. So that the best brands know their voice so well, and it's as if it's a person talking to you in your living room. I don't think that should be viewed as such a negative thing of potentially not being right for everyone, because I think what comes with that is just such a sharp point of view and creating a loyal fan base. There's a fine line there of making sure every decision you make is right for the planet and right for all people and not going out of your way to alienate anyone.
And yes, all of that matters for brands, as does the context people are viewing brand messaging in. Ipsos research indicates that many Americans vote with their wallets, and that the link between politics and purchase is complex. To manage risk in everything from marketing to manufacturing, businesses and brands need a window into these dynamics, writes Sarah Feldman, editorial director at Ipsos Public Affairs. In a recent Ipsos study, about 40% of Americans say they support or boycott businesses based on how their political beliefs align with the business's values. In other words, when media cycles and politicians pull private corporations into the political fray, the unwelcome attention can pose a threat to their bottom line. To prepare for these risks, brands must stay true to their principles and values. But a solid brand identity follows from a multidimensional understanding of one's audience, not only as consumers, but also as partisans, voters, activists, and individuals. Because when people pull out their wallet, they don't leave their convictions behind. So we've talked about existential risks, corporate risks, environmental, cyber. We've talked about brand risk, but let's bring it a little closer to home, and let's close out by talking about personal risks. It's been said that fortune sides with those who dare, and people's willingness to take risk plays a role in how we work, how we play, and even how we manage our money. Yet the degree to which people embrace risk varies, says Dr. Kenneth Carter, professor of psychology at Emory University and author of Buzz, The Inside Minds of Thrill Seekers, Daredevils, and Adrenaline Junkies. Here's how the adrenaline economy is evolving and what it will mean for brands and businesses. In his research, Carter identifies 4 kinds of thrill seekers, called thrill and adventure seeking, experience seeking, disinhibition, and finally, boredom susceptibility, which has to do with how easy it is for you to get bored and irritated when you get bored. I, for the record, am none of those. Maybe experience seeking? Kate took his online quiz and leans experience too. Over time, he says he's seen gender gaps dissipate and social media fuel an overall rise in thrill seeking. Carter hints at this, but I can watch wingsuit videos all day, or Danny McCaskill on his crazy bike adventures. And it seems I'm not alone. But as we think of the participants in the adrenaline economy, and those opting out, there are ways that technology cannot suffice for people. Or it can. Here's what Carter had to say.
Where that's becoming important is in the same way that where YouTube is important right now, or online platforms, which is curating an experience for those that can't be there. Whether it is Jeb Corliss is a wingsuit flyer, people say never. I will never be in a wingsuit jumping out of an airplane. But I can, if in virtual reality, go along with Jeb and one of his, right? So I think it's good for those who are in the middle of the sensation seeking range or the low end to be able to peek in on those experiences. I don't know if people who are high sensation seekers are going to find it authentic enough to be able to take the place of the in-person experience for them.
When they are acting as consumers, people are willing to accept different risks based on category and context. Traits like age and life stage can also play a big role, reinforcing the notion that experience informs our risk appetite. Older Americans are less willing to accept risk in many contexts, says Nathan Rosenstein, a senior research analyst at Ipsos's Behavioral Science Center. Ipsos' behavioral science team studies underlying motivations, like boredom, precarity, to understand how risk acceptance varies across demographics and purchase categories. This analysis can reveal hidden paths to engagement with current and potential consumers. But more importantly, it reveals opportunities to build trust so the chances people take on your brand are not seen as risks. In this issue, we've talked about a lot of different types of risk in our financial lives, health, entertainment, and more. And certainly one of the kind of risk that matters to marketers is how we as shoppers think about big purchase decisions. So that's what this tension is all about. In the top right, here's where we are today. We think about these tensions along the different tension lines with a series of forced choice questions. And we can take 2 of those forced choice questions and plot them on a grid like this. And in the upper right-hand corner is where our opinions lie today. We align more toward, I do a lot of research before purchasing products, and also I think about the long-term implications of my decision. And we say we research purchases and think about the long-term implications. And if this persists, we'll continue to see a proliferation of review sites and installment pay options. But AI and influencer marketing will mean we will have an ongoing war for trust. People will struggle to find research they can rely on. Will Wirecutter.com thrive? Will we lean more on friends and family for recommendations? But if these tensions shifted and we wound up more in the top left quadrant, in this world, we see people demonstrate how we are full of contradictions. We think about our future, but we just buy whatever strikes our fancy. And the thinking about our future should help us buy more sustainably, but the whimsy of our purchase could run contrary to that goal. So brands need to make it much easier in this world for shoppers to buy goods that will last and lead to a more sustainable and equitable future. And to plot a couple more together, we looked at the share of how we share our data versus how we prevent cybercrime. And the present, again in the upper right, isn't great. There's a lot of risk for people, brands, and institutions in this baseline case. But there's also a lot of opportunity to create tools to make people feel and be safer. And if we move down, we see another world that's very plausible, where things have become worse and bad actors have increasingly sophisticated tools, where our fatalistic attitudes make us the perfect targets. And one other tool we use when we're thinking about the future is future jobs to be done, which is a spin on the traditional jobs to be done framework with a forward look. And this builds on the theory that people buy products and services to fulfill certain needs or accomplish specific tasks. For example, we don't buy a security system for our home, we hire it to protect ourselves, our loved ones, and our belonging. And while it's typical in foresight to create jobs to be done, future jobs to be done clusters, we're sharing one scenario here as an example, where in a future world, we need to help protect myself and my loved ones from known and unknown risks. In a world where people navigate an increasingly complex world, they will regularly encounter a proliferation of risks. For example, in a world with greater personalization, the impacts of cybercrime and disinformation may become more familiar and intricate. So potential future jobs to be done in this world are to help me identify and my personal information safe and keep it safe from the risk of online threats, or give me the benefits of personalization without the risks, help me feel confident about the purchases I make, protect my financial health and wellness from fraud, or give me control in a world of uncertain unknowns. And I'll close as I always do. When we're thinking about this and why Ipsos does this and why we produce What the Future, it's because when you take a little bit of time, whether you do a traditional foresight exercise or you're doing trend watching, or even you're just taking half an hour out of your lunch to come hang out with me on this webinar, when you put yourself 3 or 5 or 10 years into the future and start to think about those worlds, you start to think about the context your customers will live in, the risks they'll be facing. And you start to think then about the kind of products and services those people will need in those times, what you need to start innovating today, how you'll need to message around that in order to get to the future that works best for you and your organization. And in short, when you imagine possible tomorrows, you ask better questions and do better research today. Up next is going to be the future of shopping, a great look at our retail world in the future, or maybe our world is just retail in the future. We've got a great slate. That issue is coming together as we speak, and I will be back with you to talk through the webinar next month. I want to point out again that if you sign up at future.ipsos.com, you can access the entire future of risk tables, all of that data for free. And you can also sign up for our newsletter to make sure you are updated each month when we drop a new issue of What the Future. So with that, I'm going to bid you adieu for now. Thank you again for joining us for the Future of Risk. We'll be back next month with shopping, and I'll see you all in the future.